we know in Colorado that marijuana is not the substance it used to be. We're not talking about these low-grade joints anymore. We're talking about concentrates. We're talking about a brand new, literally chemical-grade product now that's been modified. And so we have to kind of eliminate our preconceived notions about what this drug used to be and really understand what it is now because of a commercial industry that's totally altered it.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week it's just me again. Nick has become quite popular on the conference and podcast circuit, so he is in, I believe, Ogden, Utah, speaking at a Christian men's conference. We will excitedly have him back very soon. This week, I'm joined by a fascinating guest on a controversial issue. Today, we had on Luke Niforatos, who serves as the executive vice president of Smart Approaches to Marijuana. But I'll get back to that in a second. Before I do that, be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find everything we have cooking. Be sure to sign up for AM Fridays. This is our summer lecture series on Capitol Hill. We have a room there that can fit tons of people. And every Friday afternoon, for interns and junior staff on the Hill, we are hosting a summer lecture series with some of the greatest speakers across the conservative movement. We have Stephen Miller, John Iskonis, Orrin Cass. We have Russ Vogt. We have John Allen Gay. We have fantastic speakers on every issue that matters: tech, foreign policy, immigration, trade, everything that you need to know about a cutting-edge, imaginative conservative agenda. So be sure to fill that form out, as well as our general interest form, to make sure they're keeping up with everything we're doing. Back to Luke. Luke is widely recognized as one of the nation's leading drug policy experts, leveraging more than a decade of working on drug addiction and healthcare issues. Luke drives the strategy behind SAM's federal, state, and educational initiatives. He's testified in state capitals across America, and he's a sought-after guest on major media outlets including ABC, Fox News, NBC, CNBC, C-SPAN, Newsmax, and network affiliates, as well as syndicated and local radio shows in markets coast to coast. Luke has been featured in Time magazine and as a speaker at drug policy events held by The Economist, the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and hundreds of town halls. Prior to joining SAM, he was the co-founder of a successful healthcare company, and he attended the University of Denver and has a Master of Arts from Johns Hopkins University. He's a very smart guy, and we go through a comprehensive case on his perspective on the marijuana issue, as well as drug policy legalization in general. I'd be fascinated to hear you guys' feedback on this, and we'll be including tons of links to their website where they make the comprehensive academic and policy and moral case for all these issues as well. Feel free to fill out a review. 5 stars only would be fantastic on Apple Podcasts. Subscribe on YouTube to see this episode live and see our beautiful faces, or at least Luke's. Although I got a haircut, maybe I'm looking okay this week too. And thank you guys as always for listening. We'll go now to Luke Niforatos. Luke, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We always like to hear how our guests got involved in the fight they're involved in today. Tell us the story. It's a pretty circuitous one for you, and I think our guests would be fascinated by it.
Yeah. So, it's kind of funny because a lot of people are like, well, have you ever smoked marijuana? That's the number one question I get from reporters. And I'm like, why does that matter at all? Have you ever done heroin? Anyway. So, no, I don't have any story of addiction or, I actually grew up in a substance-free household, doing ministry across the world, doing refugee aid in Sudan, Africa, and doing ministry across the globe. Really. But really what brought me to this is I'm from Colorado, and my state happened to be the first state in the United States to legalize marijuana and commercialize it. And so basically saw that firsthand. I was against it from the get-go, really didn't like it, but kind of thought I was on an island. I thought I was like one of the only people in my generation, I'm a millennial, who was against it. And so kind of felt like, well, I'll keep my opinions to myself. But, as I spent the years growing up in Colorado, and kind of then I got married, had a kid, now I have 2 daughters. I saw the impact on my girls. I saw the impact on families around me, and really just came at this from a parent. And so really, to me, it all kind of came to a head when in mid 2017, my wife and I we then had just 1 daughter, taking her for a walk in her stroller, lovely community of Northeast Denver called Stapleton. And we're walking lots of young families, parks, playgrounds, all that kind of thing. So you'd expect it to be safe and great. Mm-hmm. Walking her down the sidewalk in her stroller. She's asleep. She's 10 months old. Somebody lights up a joint, and that secondhand marijuana smoke just engulfs her stroller. And my wife turns to me and she goes, every time we take her for a walk, this is happening. And I turn to her, I was like, this is like, nobody's talking about this. This is a big problem, particularly for young families. And so my wife and I both kind of said, we should actually try to do something about this. And it was really fortuitous timing because a few months later, I met Kevin Sabat, who was a former Obama, Clinton, Bush advisor on drug policy, who was trying to start an organization to take on the whole marijuana movement, along with Patrick Kennedy, the former Democratic congressman from Rhode Island. And so when I heard that there was a group coming together to try to stop this, I was like, sign me up. Let's do this. So that's kind of how I came to the issue. Was I really didn't have any personal experience, but just ended up kind of living in the state where we were kind of ground zero for drug legalization, frankly.
That's fascinating. So I want to take the wide historical view on all of this. The drug war in popular imagination has taken on extremely negative connotations. Is there any alternative history of that? Walk me through the timeline here. What was the sort of apogee of American drug enforcement and the benefits and mistakes that came out of that?
It's a great question. So no doubt about it, there's a ton of negative press on the right and the left on the drug war. It's very frequent you hear that it failed. And whenever I hear that kind of simplistic statement that the drug war failed, it's kind of a truism. People just kind of assume that it's true, but I've never heard anybody actually state why they think that it's failed or prove that why it has failed. So I'm not going to be on here today to defend the drug war. I think there's a lot of failures certainly in the drug war, but what I will say is I will question that truism with the statement of fact. And the fact is that if you look at our legal drugs, marijuana and alcohol, tobacco and alcohol, 60% of Americans use alcohol, 30% of Americans use tobacco. So our legal drugs are widely used. Our illegal drugs, heroin, fentanyl, all the meth, et cetera, are a fraction of a percent of this country use those drugs. So clearly, prohibition on drugs has worked in terms of keeping the prevalence of drugs down, the use of these drugs down. A fraction of our society uses illegal drugs. And I think that is counterintuitive to folks because they kind of think, well, it's used everywhere, but it's really not. Regular use of illicit drugs is very, very low. So I'm not giving that statistic to say the war on drugs has been a success, but what I do think is that the wide panning of that policy is really overly simplistic. Now, in terms of the history, it really all started in the 1970s when we had the Controlled Substances Act from President Nixon that scheduled all these drugs to say what was going to be illegal, and marijuana was one of them, which is an issue I work on. But what we've seen over the years is, yes, there's always a portion of society that uses drugs, and we need to figure out kind of what to do with them. But the overreaction, I would say, of saying, well, there's still some people who are using it, so let's just legalize it and kind of stop fighting the fight, so to speak. I think that is way extreme, and it would create a lot more harm than I think what's been happening with prohibition of drugs.
Yeah, very interesting. So, there's kind of two things that I think people mean when they say the drug war failed. Either they mean that the specific methods of enforcement and downstream consequences in terms of criminals, like, imprisonment and stuff,
right,
or the idea that the law is a teacher at all, which is just like patently absurd. Like, obviously, as you stated with those statistics, that making something illegal does decrease usage. Like, that's just obviously the case. And people might quibble with the particular aspects of enforcement. I think that in most cases, they've been significantly underrated. But that makes a lot of sense. Okay. In the 2000s, what was the status quo specifically when it comes to marijuana across the country? Pre any state legalizing or decriminalizing it, what was the usage rate? And then what were the first legal dominoes to start to fall in the 2000s?
Yeah, so great question. So really, we saw a massive decrease in the use of marijuana, particularly among youth. But nationwide from the 1980s into the 1990s, there was this massive movement called the parents movement, where you had parents in communities all across the country speaking up on the issues of marijuana for their kids, for teens, getting active in high schools, getting active in advocacy. You saw the Reagan administration respond to that, and we had Nancy Reagan involved and Just Say No, and all that kind of stuff started happening. So there's a huge movement of kind of education, keeping marijuana and head shops out of communities, all that stuff. Get into the 2000s and things started to change because the marijuana movement realized that this idea of legalizing marijuana wholesale was not popular, and that families were against this, parents were rising up. So they came up with a novel scheme to get around that by playing on America's sympathies in the form of medical marijuana. And you can look this up. NORML was kind of the OG marijuana legalization group, and it's a lot of potheads and stoner guys and hippie guys that you would kind of expect. And NORML, one of their founders, talks about it in an interview he did back in, it was like early 2000s or late 90s. He said, we're going to call it medical marijuana, and we will get people's sympathies. And that's exactly what happened. So California became the first state to legalize medical marijuana in late 1980s. Nothing really happened again until really early 2000, about 2006, 2008. Colorado then legalized medical marijuana, a few other places. And so basically, folks thought that what they were doing was legalizing a medicine, but it was just weed. It was joints. It was people smoking it. California's law, Colorado's law, it was very easy to get a medical marijuana card. You have glaucoma, for example.
Can you explain that? Like, what's the whole glaucoma thing? Is it real? What was the why did that become this like central meme in the marijuana legalization discourse? I frankly have no idea. I think it's just kind of an odd, like one of those unique odd illnesses that they said it cured, when now we know and we understand 10, 15 years later that marijuana does not do anything with glaucoma. In fact, interestingly, North Carolina is having debate on medical marijuana, and glaucoma was the first qualifying condition they pulled out of the bill text because they said, oh, it clearly does not help. So it's hilarious how this conversation has changed over 20 years on glaucoma. But for whatever reason, that was one of them. Pain, though, generalized pain is the top condition typically cited for people to get medical marijuana. And the average user is a male, white, in their mid 30s. Clearly not somebody who's a cancer patient, which I think is what people were kind of sold on, was this idea of medical marijuana to help cancer patients, was really where this ultimately began. So that started to change Americans' views on the subject of marijuana. Maybe I don't want it to be recreationally legal, but medical marijuana, that's a good off-ramp for me. I'm going to help patients, going to help veterans. Clearly here, often we hear about how this is going to help veterans. At the point right before Colorado's legalization of medical marijuana, what was the percentage of Americans that were using it?
Yeah, so it was starting to rise in the early 2000s. Okay. We'd seen this huge parent movement driving down use to really unprecedented low levels of use of marijuana. Then in the early 2000s, we started to see it creeping up. And it was because I think personally, advocates were getting better at selling this as medicine. You were hearing more about the medical value of marijuana. So we started to see usage rates go up. So I would say we were probably, it was down to 7 or 9% of youth in the late 90s. I think we were starting to see it go up to 13, 15, 20% of youth that were trying it in the last year. We were seeing the general adult public starting to get more interested. It was like 20, 30% at least trying it once in the last year. And so we were seeing those use rates start to rise as there was more interest in the medical value, more interest in it. One of the things they were saying was that it's less harmful than alcohol. So I think there was that dynamic as well. So you had interest, you had people trying it out. And then as you start seeing states start to legalize medical marijuana, then what we got was an industry that started commercializing the drug, changing it, promoting it. So you had medical marijuana dispensaries that were advertising these products. And so, of course, that's going to drive up usage rates. And so we saw the usage rates continue to go up through the 2000s. And now they're at unprecedented levels today. But as that usage rate started going up, then we started seeing votes start happening to legalize the substance en masse in states across the country.
So Colorado legalizes medical marijuana. Walk me through just a basic chronology of the next 10 years.
Yeah. So Colorado did this in, I think it was 2006. We legalized medical marijuana. College students. I was, I graduated in 2012. So, I had a lot of friends in college that had medical marijuana cards. They came from out of states where they didn't have medical marijuana. They came to Colorado, go to college, get a medical marijuana card, start selling on the campus, et cetera. So it was totally a farce program. Everybody knew it in the state of Colorado, but it was called medicine because it was political. And so...
and was this... Did the proliferation happen because doctors took it as minimally seriously as the people did? I mean, like, how did it become so easy to just get a card?
Yeah, so it had nothing to do with the medical doctors at all. That's why. It was a purely political play. And I think people heard medical and they saw patients on TV. They trotted out, one of the biggest, highest performing ads in Colorado was an ad with a veteran who said, I have PTSD. I use marijuana and it helps me. And, not going to question folks' anecdotal evidence, but we can't make statewide policy or nationwide policy based on anecdote. And what the research tells us, one of the big misnomers out there is that we have no research on marijuana because it's illegal. We have tens of thousands of research studies on marijuana. And the research is very unequivocal that using marijuana actually exacerbates PTSD, exacerbates anxiety. That's what we've got right now. And so, but nonetheless, you have that ad. It's very convincing for folks. They want to help veterans. The drug industries have been really good at using veterans as stooges, quite frankly, to legalize and profit off of their substances. And so anyway, that was a big push in Colorado, was to see that happen. And medical doctors had nothing to do with the conversation. American Medical Association against legalization, against medical marijuana, against recreational, Academy of Pediatrics against it. Every statewide society of medicine was against it. So doctors had nothing to do with it. And when you look at the program now in terms of who is recommending medical marijuana, because you can't prescribe it. And I think a lot of people say prescription, but it's federally illegal substance. There's no dosage. There's no science involved with this. So you don't get a prescription. You just get a card that says, my doctor said it's okay for me to go buy weed. That's literally what this is. But you look at the percentages, and it's about 2% of doctors are actually telling their patients, I will recommend this for you. So 2% of doctors are making up like 80-90% of the recommendations for medical marijuana. So very little medical industry involvement at all, because it's not scientific.
Mm-hmm. And does it become just a racket for those small population of doctors, like they end up building their entire practice around it?
That's exactly right. So if you look up in Colorado, doctors, medical marijuana, you'll see doctors that their entire practice is literally just medical marijuana recommendations. They're like medical marijuana docs. And it's a disgrace to the profession, in my opinion, because it's not helping patients. It's clearly a way to get them access.
Is there any liability imposed on those doctors if they make a diagnosis and the person misuses it and they end up getting sicker or hurting themselves?
As of right now, there's no liability at all because they're not prescribing it. And that was actually something we tried to work on in Colorado 2 years ago. Was we passed a House bill that was trying to increase more of the physician involvement in the process, because Colorado is a state that wasn't going to roll it back, but could we make it more accountable? So we said, look, doctors, if you're going to recommend this to your patient, you have to put the potency of marijuana, which that's something that's really changed a lot in recent years. We can talk about that. You have to put the potency amount you're recommending. You have to try to put, some sort of dosage, which is kind of crazy, like how many puffs a day of a joint of marijuana or whatever. Kind of an interesting place we're in. We try to get them to be more specific with it to increase that accountability. And doctors really didn't like that, because they said, well, this isn't something that's FDA, validated. So how am I supposed to make a recommendation on anything? And we were like, that's exactly the right question to be asking. Why should you be doing that? And so most doctors won't.
Again, back to the timeline, what started happening in the 2010s?
So commercialization is what started happening. Mm-hmm. So people thought it was medicine. What we got was a huge industry. Big tobacco started getting involved. As early as the 1970s, R.J. Reynolds, in their documents that were discovered through discovery of the class action lawsuit and all of that, they had plans to get into marijuana. Big tobacco has been trying to do this for 50 years. R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris, all of them have had plans for more than 50 years to get into marijuana eventually. And so what we discovered was they had been kind of in the background pushing this. Big alcohol was another player that would come in a little bit later, but commercialization is what happened. We had an industry that was advertising these products, then potency started to go up. So more people were getting hooked and addicted to higher potency formulations of this drug, which had never existed before, because there wasn't an industry that was in a capitalist society in a free market that was innovating around these products. So with medical marijuana, you had that industry and the ability to do that, and the advertising. So usage went up, interest went up. The messages got out across the country from an industry that had a profit incentive to get legalized in other states. So more states started legalizing medical marijuana. So the interest is going up. Colorado and Washington State then in 2012 became the first two states in the country to legalize recreational marijuana. And that's when you really saw the industry blow up. You saw products we'd never seen before. Shatters, waxes, candies, concentrates, THC levels, that's the ingredient that gets you high from marijuana. We saw that get up to 99% potency, where literally just 2 decades prior to legalization, the potency was between 1% and 3% THC. So you go from 1% and 3% to 99%. Then we started seeing addiction rates really start to skyrocket. Most people don't think of marijuana as something that's addictive. They think of, joints and whatever. And we've all heard that, marijuana never hurt anybody. Marijuana is not addictive, blah, blah, these various myths out there. We literally saw our country go from, in the 1990s, 1 in 10 people who use marijuana in the last year would develop a cannabis use disorder, an addiction, to then starting in 2010, 2020, 1 in 3 people who use marijuana in the last year will develop a cannabis use disorder. And that's according to our nation's top research institutions. So I think people would think that's crazy, but what they don't realize is what changed from 2000 to 2020, frankly, which is a huge industry that changed these products.
Yeah. So let's talk about the drug itself. One of the interesting riffs we were talking about right before the show is that the tobacco leaf itself has not changed very much in the last 5 centuries, 10 centuries, whatever it might be. And maybe I'm wrong about that. But it doesn't seem to be the case that that's the case. Now, there is a whole secondary thing with vaping in terms of creating a much more potent vehicle for delivery. But it seems like there's a very prolific, active, and productive industry that is constantly changing the marijuana plant, its composition, its potency. Walk me through how the drug itself and the drug delivery vehicles have changed in the last 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah, great question. And I think the tobacco historical example is really a poignant one for this discussion because it really highlights why I personally and my organization are against the legalization of marijuana and frankly, any other drugs that they try to legalize as well. And so let's just look at the example. So the tobacco leaf has been, people have been smoking tobacco for thousands of years, been ingrained in society. No one over the last several thousand years has been dying from cancer related to tobacco use, or very few people. And, so thousands of years of use of the tobacco leaf. What changed about 100 years ago where all of a sudden millions and millions, tens of millions of people start dying from tobacco-related cancers across the globe? Well, what changed was the invention of the cigarette, the creation of a new big tobacco industry, global supply chain model, advertising, commercialization, mega companies getting involved, adulterating the tobacco in these cigarettes with nicotine, with ammonia, with all these other additives, which they did because the for-profit incentive is to sell a lot of products. And that's another thing I want to touch on too, because the people think of companies as, well, they don't want to hurt me. They have my best interests at heart, or at least I think some people think that. and what we understand, and maybe even in other issues, when you look at the conservative movement, is there's clearly a lot of other motives involved. One of the key motives, and I learned this with my startup, is I had a product for doctors. I wanted them to use that product as much as possible. It was an app for doctors to help them see more patients. That was my company, and I wanted to use that product as much as possible because I made more money when that happened. That was my profit incentive as a for-profit company. When you have a for-profit company involved in drug selling, their incentive and their motivation is to make more money. The way they make more money is when you use their product more. If that's an addictive drug, then their incentive is to addict you to that drug. Not saying that everyone that runs a tobacco company wants to, kill and murder everybody and get them all addicted, but their profit alignment is supportive of addiction. So the industry takes tobacco, adulterates it, invents a cigarette, figures out a way to, mass produce it, get people using it a lot, addicted. And then that's what we had happen, where they adulterated this product, made it much more addictive, and made a lot more money off of it globally. And then we had all the problems. Okay. So that is a great case study for what we're seeing now with marijuana, where I talked about potency. So marijuana as a plant, on average, has 1 to 3% potency of THC. Woodstock days, people smoking a joint. You didn't see a lot of huge public health problems with the low grade weed of yesteryears. And so people thought, well, it's no big deal. It's just a plant. Like, let's just legalize it. And that's what I hear a lot about is, how dare you criminalize a plant? And I'm like, well, like opium, comes from, so it's just, anyway, we could get into the plant discussion, but it's no longer a plant now. Because of the commercial industry, we're seeing exactly what happened with tobacco happen with marijuana, where they're taking the plant, adulterating it, genetically modifying it, altering it in chemical labs, making it up to 99% potency, which has never naturally been, making it more addictive, making it more harmful in a lot of ways, adulterating it. And so we're seeing the exact same thing play out with marijuana. And so this is why we can't go down the road of legalization of substances, particularly within a free market capitalist context, because companies will innovate. That's the beauty of the free market, is companies will innovate, find ways to get their products into people's hands easier and more cheaply. That's great when it's a phone. That's great when it's technology to help make people's lives better. It is really dystopian, quite frankly, if it involves addictive drugs that can harm people and harm society.
So you've used this word a couple times, and it's extremely controversial. And I want you to break down what exactly the status of the science is right now, which is addiction.
Yeah.
You've also used the term cannabis use disorder. What is the current state of science on the addictiveness of marijuana? What are some of the misconceptions about it? The public meme is that it's just completely not addictive. What are you talking about, you dumb root boomer? Like, what's the actual status quo?
Yeah, well, so if you ask anyone in the scientific community, in the medical community, it's not even a debate. The ICD-10 code, diagnosis code for marijuana addiction is cannabis use disorder. It's got a whole code group that you'll be diagnosed with if you go to the doctor and you have it. So it's not even a discussion in the scientific community. It's not even a debate. The only place where it is a debate is with people with profit incentive, industry representatives who say it's no big deal. And we've seen this all before. Purdue Pharma, opioids. There was one little paragraph of text in the New England Journal of Medicine in early 2000 or late 90s that said people using OxyContin, only just under 2% of them find it to be habit forming with opioids, with OxyContin. And most of us would look at that and say that's insane now. But for 2 decades, Purdue Pharma and all the opioid guys made a killing off of that one paragraph of erroneous text in one research study that was used to say, oh, it's not addictive. And we're seeing the exact same thing play out with marijuana, where you have some people who didn't get addicted to it. Yeah, like there are people who didn't get addicted to OxyContin. There are people who don't get addicted to cigarettes. We're not talking about a drug that's universally addictive. We're talking about percentages here. And so, low grade marijuana was 10% addiction rate. Now we're seeing 1 in 3, about a 30% addiction rate with marijuana now. And that is established science. You can look up National Institute of Drug Abuse, National Institutes of Health. The research is really rock solid on that. So that's one key thing that has changed. The other thing in the research that we're seeing that is really, in my opinion, maybe even more concerning is the link between high grade marijuana and mental illness. So the Lancet Journal of Psychiatry is probably one of the most sterling institutions out there that does research on this subject. And they've released several massive population level studies just in the last 5 years that have looked across thousands of people using marijuana. And what they found is regular users of today's high potency marijuana 5 times more likely to develop schizophrenia or psychosis, which for those of you who've read Alex Berenson's book, you should definitely read it. It's called Tell Your Children. It's about marijuana. He looks at the link between marijuana use and the psychosis induced by that and violence. Which is a really interesting link that is worth reading more about. But you see this linkage now with schizophrenia, psychosis. Now we're seeing things in depression and suicidal ideation that we never saw before, all because of the changes we've seen in this substance. And I will tell you, in Colorado, the number one drug that comes up in our youth suicide toxicology by far is THC. It's marijuana. So I think people, again, will listen to this and say, is this reefer madness? Like, is it, this is crazy. It's just marijuana. And what I tell them is, we know in Colorado that marijuana is not the substance it used to be. We're not talking about these low-grade joints anymore. We're talking about concentrates. We're talking about a brand new, literally chemical-grade product now that's been modified. And so we have to kind of eliminate our preconceived notions about what this drug used to be and really understand what it is now, because of a commercial industry that's totally altered it. So I would say those are the 2 big areas in the research that we're seeing.
So walk me through what marijuana addiction is actually like physiologically for people. What are the symptoms of it? What are the other consequences that the delivery methods cause in people in terms of their biological response? What is the health issues that come out of it? Yeah,
so I mean, it really functions like any other addiction. People have experienced addiction in different ways. Some people, it's very extreme, withdrawals and sweating and kind of all the things that come with trying to going into withdrawal. Mm-hmm. Some people, it's very easy to quit cold turkey. I mean, it really kind of runs the full gambit, but it functions like the addiction to any other substance. And I think that's a key lack of education point, I think, around addiction for most Americans, is they think, cigarettes, heroin, these things are just addictive in and of themselves. And so I would never use that because, that's just purely addictive. But drugs like marijuana, maybe that's not addictive. And what it really comes down to is drugs hit people in different ways. There are people who can smoke a cigarette a day and then just stop, and it's not addictive for them at all. And then there are people who they start once and then they go all the way. And so we don't fully understand why that is. Some people have genetic predispositions for those things. Mm-hmm. But what we do understand is once you develop an addiction, it is a disease as we understand it. So you make a choice, you make a series of bad choices in terms of getting into, using a certain substance. Then you've developed an addiction. Now what you've got is a disease that needs to be treated. And that disease, and this is what concerns me the most about it, Saurabh, is that disease is antithetical to your natural functioning as a human being. it causes you to do things that destroy yourself. It causes you to do things that destroy your family. It causes you to do things that destroy society, frankly, that you don't want to do if you were in a rational frame of mind. But addiction can drive you to do horrible things in order to sustain that addiction. And that's why we understand it as a disease, because it drives you to do very awful things. And so from my perspective, I look at the family as a really key base unit of society. And I've seen addiction time and time again destroying families in this country, because you'll literally end up in a situation where someone's addicted. They will steal from their relatives. They'll steal from their parents. They'll, pawn off, sell their car, whatever. They'll do things to destroy and hurt their family in order to sustain their addiction that they would not do if they were living in that addiction. And so that's where, to me, the conversation around drugs is so vitally important, because if we legalize and sustain these things, there will be people driving a profit off of the continued addiction of folks. And that is, in my opinion, going to denigrate our institutions and our pillars of society, which in my opinion begins with the family.
So one of the arguments that was made in favor of marijuana legalization that we now have the ability to analyze is that it would reduce drug-related crime, that gang warfare or gang violence, cartels,
right.
Other downstream consequences of illicit substance trade would erode if you legalize it. Is that true?
Yeah, no, El Chapo did not become a dentist after they legalized. He is trying to get a Wells Fargo bank account, though, and I'll talk to you about the Safe Banking Act later. But I do think that was the big promise that was made. So there was a few big promises made to us in Colorado. First was it was going to help our veterans. Second was that we'd get rid of the drug dealers and the cartels, and we'd eliminate the black market. And that has proven to be completely false. So most people, I think, would be shocked to know that more than half of Colorado's market is still served by the black market. In other words, more than half of the people using marijuana are getting their marijuana from the black market in Colorado. 70% of California's market is black market. 70% of Oregon's market is black market. And these are states where they've had nearly a decade to mature their marijuana industry.
And why is this? Are people looking for cheaper stuff or what?
Yeah. So, two main driving factors. One is the black market will never pay taxes, and the regulated market will always pay taxes. So it's going to always be cheaper on the black market. Second piece of this is the fact that people think one of the biggest things I get pushed back on is they say, well, Luke, we don't buy moonshine anymore. And that's completely besides the point, because alcohol is a much more difficult product to produce at home. Marijuana plants, you can grow them abundantly in your backyard or in your house very easily. And so that is a big concern, because it's easy to grow it on the black market. You have cartels that come into suburban neighborhoods around Denver and in other states as well, but I just know this from personal experience. Cartels, we have 3 new foreign cartels that came into our state after we legalized marijuana.
Wow.
Yeah, China, Mexico, and I think it was a Nicaraguan cartel. So 3 new cartels came in. They didn't go away. They came in, and they're using the cover of legalization to buy up houses, which has driven up our real estate values because there's less inventory. So they bought up suburban homes, gut them, turned them into grow houses where they have hundreds of marijuana plants that they're growing there. And they're selling it on the black market. And so legalization is literally the cover for drug dealers to continue doing what they do. And not only that, legalization has promoted the use of the substance. So it's creating more demand. And that demand is then going to the black market, going to the dealers, going to the cartels. And so we're having more issues with violent crime and property crime. In fact, there's a lot of research now that's coming out in Colorado and a couple other states that's found in places where there's legalization, there's more violent crime. It's gone up astronomically in Colorado since we legalized it, more property crime. And that's because we're seeing more cartel activity, more drug dealers involved. And so it's odd, and it's just a little bit of a side note, but it's odd to me to see some Republicans out there espousing legalization of marijuana, for whatever reason, liberty reasons, whatever it might be, when we're in the middle of a crime crisis and we're pointing to violent crime, we're pointing to property crime. In Colorado, a big point of discussion in the elections last year was around the issue of theft of cars and all these things. Well, you ask any chief of police, I serve on the board for my chief of police in my city in Colorado. You ask any chief of police what the driving factor is for property theft and car theft, it's to buy drugs. It's for people who are addicted to drugs. So it is a really weird look to, on the one hand, say we need to address the crime crisis in this country, and then on the other hand say let's keep passing laws to legalize marijuana when we know from the research that it is driving up crime in states that have chosen to legalize it. You look at the crime rates in Colorado and California and these other states and compare it to the crime rates in states where they don't have legal marijuana and they don't have legal drugs. It is a totally different picture.
What about the idea of gateway drugs? This is another thing that the cultural meme is that you're a dumb boomer who doesn't understand what he's talking about if you call marijuana a gateway drug. Is it?
That is a great question. So what I would say is no, it's not a gateway drug in terms of from the this is just purely from science. Not a gateway drug in the sense of you use marijuana and you're therefore going to start injecting heroin. Not likely. In fact, most people are not going to do that. But what we do know is that between 95 and 97% of people who are addicted to heroin, who are addicted to cocaine, they started with marijuana. So you can't deny the linkage between marijuana and other drugs, but it's not a cause and effect. So it's not a use marijuana, then use meth. It's more of a circumstance of the association in drug use. So I think a lot of people in America think, well, that person just uses that drug, just one drug. But in reality, it's polysubstance use. Nobody starts using fentanyl as their first drug. Nobody. Nobody starts using meth as their first drug. They usually start with marijuana. And then once their body has kind of built that predisposition to start using substances, they'll go from marijuana to other drugs. So what we call it is and the literature really justifies this as a pathway to other substances. And so do most people who use marijuana use other drugs? Maybe not, but most people who are using other drugs started with marijuana. So it's kind of an interesting nuance there.
I'm curious if you could give me a little bit more color on the different delivery methods of marijuana and what they've caused and done. I had this hilarious moment a couple of months ago where
don't tell me you used a pot gummy bear.
No, I did not.
That's usually where these stories go.
I was going through Instagram and I kept on getting this ad for like an olive oil infuser, and I kept on looking at it. I was like, why would you infuse olive oil that way? You could just, if you want to put rosemary or basil in your olive oil, you can just saute it in a pan. And it like took me a week before I like suddenly woke up in a cold sweat. I was like, oh, I see what that's an ad for. And it's like all the
THC
advertising,
infused.
Right? All the advertising is very clever. It didn't actually indicate what it was for, because I'm sure there's laws against
Although
that.
I'm Greek, and I will tell you, olive oil infusing is quite frequent in my family.
Well, but you can do it without a machine, is my understanding.
True. Yes, we've been doing it for thousands of years.
So tell me about the different delivery methods. What did the prevalence of vaping do to greater THC addiction? All of that. How did that work?
Yeah. So back to the commercialization issue. Commercialization, innovation, companies finding new ways to deliver the drug in a cheaper and easier to access way. Vaping was really a key piece of that, and that started with Juul, which we all understand was for nicotine vaping, but not a lot of people know that Juul started off as a THC vaping company.
Oh, really?
Called PAX. Yeah, and PAX spun off Juul to do the nicotine side of the house, and PAX does the THC side of the house. PAX is doing everything that Juul got in trouble for doing, targeting kids, social media influencers, digital advertising, all that stuff. PAX is doing that now and getting off scot-free, which is really fascinating. So yeah, we're seeing that whole dynamic play out. So they've vaping THC oils, that's a big thing. Dabbing is another thing. So dabbing is really the way youth are using it now in legal states. And basically what dabbing involves is kind of like vaping, but it's like a little dab of a little bit of wax of THC, highly potent, usually up to 99% concentrate, and then they vaporize it and use a dab rig to inhale it, and it gets them very high, very, very fast. Folks will black out, brown out. You can see it on YouTube. It's kind of a crazy thing. So that is kind of some of the newer delivery mechanisms that we're seeing that you think about this just from a societal perspective. We don't have a scientific understanding of what that's going to look like, of millions of people doing that on a regular basis over an entire generation. What does that do to you down the road? What does that do to economic productivity? What does that do to, we're seeing some issues with marijuana use and, fertility, for example, for men. So what does that do to the family? What does that do to, offspring? What are the downstream effects of that? We had to learn it the hard way with tobacco, where we had no idea what was going to happen when we started mass producing and mass using a substance. Are we going to have to go through that all over again with marijuana at a population level? Those are the kinds of things that we think about. But yeah, we have all these new innovative ways to use it that are creating more harm, more addiction, particularly with dabbing. I'll just give an example of a neighbor of mine. Her name is Laura Stack. She lives just a few minutes from me down the road in Colorado. Her son, Johnny Stack, 2 years ago, dabbed marijuana, had a psychotic episode after that, and then jumped off of a parking garage to his death. So these are the stories that are now accompanying this. And so, yeah, I mean, that's different than smoking a joint, in the 1970s. Very different.
Yeah. I mean, it's even a meme in like comedy where like, older comedians will talk about, you used to be able to pass around a joint and be a light buzz, whereas now it's like you're going to like go to Mars.
Right.
What about the children side of this, right? I mean, with the proliferation of anything, it will inevitably percolate down to children. One, do the advocates of marijuana legalization, do they still make bright line distinctions about childhood use versus adulthood use? But in practice, how is that actually playing out?
Yeah. Well, the marijuana industry has been really good with their big brother, Big Tobacco, who now, by the way, is their largest investor. Altria, Philip Morris is the largest tobacco company on the planet. They put $2 billion into the marijuana industry. So they're, very much closely aligned. They've learned a lot from tobacco. And they say this is only about adults. It's not about kids. And one of the biggest arguments I hear is legalize, regulate, so you can card people. And so intuitively, people think, oh, if it's legal and regulated and they're carding people at the door, then like surely kids aren't going to get into it then. And then I kind of look around the room and I say, well, I went to public high school. How did that work for alcohol and tobacco exactly? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know where people kind of have forgotten about like the fact that those things flow like water through youth's hands in this country. So legalizing, regulating does not prevent our kids from getting into it. And so, yeah, youth are using it. If you look at, so I have a slide deck I do on this, but if you look at a graph of yearly use and monthly use for youth in legal states versus non-legal states, it's not even in the same conversation. I mean, it's much higher in legal states than in non-legal states. So youth are using it more. Addiction rates are higher. So there was a study that came out recently that said after legalization, every single state that legalized marijuana saw a 25% increase in cannabis use disorder for youth. So youth are getting more addicted to this substance in legal states. We know the message that it sends because the products that they're using are clearly targeting kids. So with tobacco, a lot of us are probably too young to like know have experienced it, personally, but they were using, candy cigarettes. They had Joe Camel. They had mascots. They were using all sorts of child-friendly packaging and colors and products and all that stuff. We're seeing that now a little bit with Juul and some of the other vaping companies. Same thing is happening with the marijuana industry, where they've got, Sesame Street characters. Like a pot shop in Denver was literally using Cookie Monster to advertise its pot cookies. Then they've got Girl Scouts flavors. I could go on and on and on. Gummy bears, all these things. And people say, well, we'll just regulate that. Like we'll write laws that say that's wrong, right? And it's like, every single state that's legalized marijuana says you can't target kids. You can't have child-friendly packaging. So explain to me how Cookie Monster ends up getting through and getting approved by regulators. Well, it's because these industries are able to overpower the regulatory state. And you can't possibly fund these regulatory agencies, nor maybe should we. That's another conversation. You can't possibly fund them enough to stop a multi-billion-dollar industry from doing whatever it is they want to do. And I think that's what we understand with tobacco.
So 10 years on from the big legalization wave that started, what is the status quo of marijuana legalization across America? How many states have legalized, how many medical, and how many have chosen a different path? And then let's have a conversation about what you guys are doing in order to push back against the legalization wave.
Yeah, so there's about 22 states that have legalized recreational marijuana, about 30-ish states with medical marijuana.
And that includes that list of 22.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 8 more.
Yeah. So and then and about 36 medical marijuana, but those medical marijuana programs kind of vary. Some states like Iowa allow like very low potency CBD oil, and they call that medical marijuana. So it kind of varies, but I would say like 25-ish states with kind of full blown medical marijuana programs. And so what we're seeing right now is what started with the normals of the world and the kind of stoner generation now has become a very industry focused effort of just, Constellation Brands is the largest alcohol conglomerate in America. They're now $4 billion in the marijuana industry, along with tobacco, who I talked about. So you have alcohol, tobacco, and then like the former Purdue Pharma CEO is in the marijuana industry now, which is crazy. He wrote the playbook for OxyContin, and now he's writing it for marijuana. So anyway, and so you see these big folks, and you see hedge funds from Wall Street getting involved as well. So it's become a very big business push, billions and billions of dollars being made, billions of dollars at stake. Interestingly, and we'll get into the Safe Banking Act maybe later, but the American Bankers Association and a lot of the big banks now are making marijuana a top issue for them because they want to bank this stuff. So it's really becoming a gold rush in terms of a money play. Very little conversation about whether or not this is a good idea for society or whether or not more people should be using drugs or getting addicted, blah, blah, blah. But that's really what's happening now. And so we're seeing kind of an inflection point, though, I will say, where yes, we've got, large number of states that have done this, but just in the last 2 years, we've seen 4 out of the 6 states that voted on it reject it. Most recently, it was Oklahoma, where every single county in Oklahoma rejected legalization.
Wow.
Just a couple months ago. Including Tulsa. Everywhere. Every single county rejected it by a wide margin. And so I think what we're starting to see, and Arkansas had a similar interesting result where it's like a 20-point victory.
What were the 6 states?
So Arkansas, Oklahoma, North Dakota, and South Dakota all rejected it. Maryland passed it. And there was one other state, and I'm forgetting.
Montana? No.
Yeah, Montana. Yes. So Maryland, Montana over the last 2 years. So it was interesting to see, though, just with Oklahoma and Arkansas, which were just in the last year, rejecting it, where we're reaching an inflection point of kind of, there's a lot of now research, a lot of articles now being written about the negative aspects of legalization, the crime impacts, the increases in drug use, the fact that it never helped with the opioid crisis like people said it would. In fact, you look at states with marijuana and they actually have higher rates of fentanyl overdose than states without marijuana, which doesn't necessarily mean it's causal, but it just means, marijuana didn't fix that problem for us. So I think we're seeing a lot more written about this issue, a lot more understanding of, well, this is what happens when you legalize it. And I think voters are now kind of saying, I don't want my state to become like Colorado, quite frankly, which is unfortunate because I'm from Colorado, love my state, but made a really bad decision with that policy call. And so I think, though, people are kind of waking up to that.
Now, the question is which people, right? Because you just mentioned of the 4 states that rejected legalization, dark red states.
Yeah.
And then Maryland is not a dark red state, but Montana is considered one. So break down demographically for me. What are the constituencies that are opposed to legalization? What are the constituencies that are for it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a lot of people want to try to make this like a red blue thing, but it's really kind of a funky issue. It cuts into both sides. So you'll see on the Republican side, you'll have folks like the Koch brothers, for example, who are pro-legalizing all drugs. And certainly the Koch bros and AFP in certain states have pushed for legalization of marijuana. So you have kind of the libertarian bent folks that say this is a personal decision. So they're kind of supporting in many ways. And then on the left, you'll have groups like, what would they call probably like the blue dog Democrats, like, our co-founder, Congressman Kennedy, you would say is a more conservative Democrat. I think many people would say. And so there are those folks who say, look, I don't want to see more drug addiction in my communities. Then you'll have an interesting segment on the left of the kind of old school hippie stoner guy who he remembers smoking joints back in the day and like Woodstock and hates the idea of corporate pot. So they don't want to see it legalized either. So you'll have interesting bedfellows on the left. And on the right, obviously, you'll have the traditional, conservatives, the Christian conservatives and other folks who are against this from a spiritual perspective. But I think what's interesting is the dynamic that addiction plays in all this, because if someone has family experience with addiction, they've seen what marijuana can do in their family, to their kid, to their relative, or they've seen what other drug abuse can do, then they are much more likely to be against legalizing it because they see the impact that drugs have on society. So I do think as we see this addiction crisis grow, people are understanding that this isn't just a personal decision that only impacts the person who's deciding to use drugs. It's much greater than that. It has much larger societal impact. It's devastating to families, drug use can be. And I think that changes people's perspective on policy issues around this.
What's the status when it comes to young voters?
Yeah, young voters, I mean, let's just be frank. The polls are really clear. If you're under the age of 40, you are, very likely to support the legalization of marijuana. Extremely likely. And I think
we're talking like 4-1, 5-1,
yeah, it's like 4-1.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, that I think is a real issue. And I often say, look, if I could just get everyone in my generation to have a kid and a mortgage, it would change this whole discussion, because I've got 2 little girls and a mortgage and a wife and a household. And I just think about the world differently than I did when I was in my early 20s. And so I do think to some degree, we're going to see that change as responsibilities grow, as people get older and I think get more kind of rich life experiences. But the other piece of this is just, I think we have to get the message out there that it doesn't, we don't need to reboot the war on drugs in order to kind of have a sane view on legalization. And I think that's a key message to the younger demographic is, look, this isn't about criminalizing folks. We don't have to do that. In fact, one thing my organization has positioned itself for is lowering criminal penalties for minor marijuana possession, for the simple fact of, look, like somebody doesn't need to necessarily have a permanent criminal record if they made a bad decision when they were 14 years old. And I think that's something we probably can all mostly agree on. And so I think getting to the younger demographics about that, does somebody need to go spend time in prison for a low level offense? Maybe, maybe not. But I think, understanding that, on that same token, legalizing and commercializing and promoting this is actually going to make society worse, and it's going to hurt you in a lot of different ways. And so I do think that that's a key piece. And then the other piece is just understanding the big business dynamic of it. The fact that there are companies that literally want to addict younger generations and do not care what their future aspirations are, but just want to make money off of them.
Are there any corporate constituencies that oppose marijuana legalization?
A lot of the folks in the transportation realm, people in chambers of commerce.
Because like truckers, you can't recruit truckers if they have marijuana usage, right?
That's exactly right. Construction. I mean, you think about, healthcare field, surgeon. Yeah, I'll never forget.
Pilots.
What?
Pilots?
Yeah, pilots, airline pilots, et cetera. I'll never forget, I was living in Denver the day we went live with legalization in 2014. And my next door neighbor, I was a bachelor at the time in an apartment. My next door neighbor in my apartment complex he'd just finished his residency as an orthopedic surgeon. And he had a little bag in his hand on day one of legalization going into his door. And I was like, what's that? He goes, oh, it's marijuana. It's legal now. I asked him, I was like, aren't you an orthopedic surgeon? Like, aren't you going to be doing surgery soon? He's like, oh, well, it's fine. Thought, I don't want you doing my surgery. So that's a huge problem. And so those constituencies are definitely against this. Truckers Association, all that kind of stuff.
Are they meaningfully activated against it, or
pretty active? I mean, it varies. A lot of times at the state level, you'll see chambers of commerce get really involved. They'll take the lead in terms of opposing this because they have membership that are all affected. Interestingly, one note on the workforce issue, Quest Diagnostics just did a big release last week, and I think the Wall Street Journal covered it, where we are at a 25-year high for marijuana positivity rates in the workforce. So people are showing up high to work in unprecedented levels. And we did a focus group kind of, we were trying to figure out what are the messages that work best for folks. You spit stats at them like that stat, don't really care. But then you say, imagine if you were going to work at the factory and your coworker comes in high and has an accident and hurts you, then that comes home for them because they see that personal impact of, wow, that person deciding to get high, being impaired and then coming to work and then hurting me. That's not something I want to see happen. School bus drivers, that's another, point. But so yes, you'll see those kinds of corporate constituencies, but nothing like, what we're seeing in terms of the movement with the banks and the big addiction giants like alcohol and tobacco.
Has the marijuana industry tried to lobby for like non-discrimination for, basically trying to create like hiring and firing protections for people who have marijuana in their system? So
Rob, they want to make marijuana users a protected class. It's a novel concept that we've never heard of before. So Nevada became the first state in the country to ban employers from firing people for their marijuana use.
Really?
So
any employer, like including
employer,
airlines and
airlines. Transportation, you can't reject them based on their use of marijuana.
Wow.
So that whole discussion is changing quite significantly. And so, and you can see from the industry.
Has that caused an increase in like accident rates in that field?
It's a good question. They just did this like a year ago or 2 years ago. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But I mean, that's an open question. Every time we see, train crash, we see other issues. There's always the question of, was that person impaired? What's in there? And I will tell you though, it's just kind of funny. With marijuana advocates, like unless there is a joint smoking in the person's mouth as they crash the car, they're always like, that person wasn't actively high on marijuana. It's like you literally have to find them like flying the plane, like a video of them inhaling and being impaired for them to like accept that impairment had something to do with it. But we know from the science that the impairment can last up to 30 days after you use it. Yeah.
So let's talk about what the big federal policy fights are going to be, and specifically the ones that Sam is focused on. Do you guys call it Sam?
Yeah, okay. Sam. Yep.
So at the federal level, one of the memes that's floated around a lot is, golly gee, these dispensaries are so besotted. They have to carry around bags of cash that are getting stolen, pallets of cash that are getting stolen because they're so successful, but they can't bank. Tease out this issue for me, separate fact from fiction, and explain what they're trying to do at the federal level.
Yeah. So what the biggest thing that's the biggest possibility for federal action on marijuana laws is the Safe Banking Act, which they're pitching, like you said, as a public safety issue. Pallets of cash everywhere, and armed, with armed guard. Yeah. We're living in a third world country in states that have legalized marijuana, and I will tell you, there's dozens of pot shops nearby to where I live. Dozens. I've never once seen a cashed car. I've never once seen armed guard. None of that is happening because they've all figured out how to digitally take payment, whether it's through cryptocurrency or they've got third-party companies they can take credit cards with now and all that stuff. Interestingly, so in 2019, they had testimony on the Safe Banking Act, and they had the CEO of a company called LiveWell, horrible misnomer, but a company called LiveWell that has pot shops in a number of different states, including Colorado. And he testified before the state Senate banking or U.S. Senate banking that they only take cash. And on their website, they said they take credit cards. And we sent somebody undercover to their pot shops, and they take credit cards and debit cards. So he lied to the U.S. Senate about that. So there's kind of like this secret between the industry and what they're telling Congress and then what's actually happening on the ground. I literally have a picture of a pot shop in Aspen that literally says American Express, MasterCard, Visa. So it's just... So
are they violating the law? Are the credit card companies violating the law? Like, what exactly is the law there? What is the regulatory thing they're trying to get over and lie about?
They are all violating the law. Mm-hmm. So it's federally legal, obviously, to distribute, sell, promote marijuana. It's also federally legal to bank them. So the banks, the credit card processing companies, the credit card companies, and the marijuana companies are all violating federal law right now. And so Safe Banking Act is about basically creating safety for them. The crazy thing about it is that it's basically financially legalizing marijuana while keeping it federally illegal. So you can't use it, can't sell it, can't promote it, but you can bank it. So the banks, it's really quite a feat for the banks. They get to make a bunch of money while everyone's still criminalized for it, and they laugh their way to their own banks, which is kind of funny. And so it's a horrible bill from a lot of perspectives, but what it's really about has nothing to do with public safety. What it's really about is billions of dollars in investment that needs to come in risk-free. So we know that Altria, the largest tobacco company, their number one goal is to get the Safe Banking Act passed, because then they can have a risk-free investment in American marijuana markets, and then they can really go hook, line, and sinker on federal legalization. So that's
so
kind
it's
of
not just about being able to transact with the pot shops. It's about being able to do like investable capital and stuff as well. How does that work? They're
already transacting safely, and we have them under oath on our website at learnaboutsam.org, where they've talked about how they're using banks. Everything's fine for the industry in terms of financial services, which it shouldn't be. They should all be, prosecuted, but that's another story. So that is not the issue. The issue is major institutional investors. Yes, they've already got investment from tobacco and alcohol companies that are willing to take that risk, but a lot of the major institutional investors are still waiting until they have some sort of federal assurance in America. Because right now, Canada is the only country in the world with federal legalization. So they can invest in Canadian pot companies, but it's fraught with risk in America, because at any given moment, the Department of Justice could decide to do their jobs for once and enforce federal law and shut down these pot shops, and a lot of people lose their money. So they want it to be risk-free. That's the whole point. So the whole point is about billions of dollars in transactions and investment capital that they want to have happen. And don't just listen to me about it. Former Speaker John Boehner, he will get a $20 million check if the Safe Banking Act passes. He's at a National Cannabis Roundtable. He used to be inalterably opposed, as he said, to marijuana. Now he's on marijuana boards along with tobacco boards. And so he has said that the moment Safe Banking Act passes, there's billions of dollars in institutional capital that is ready to jump into marijuana in America. That's what he's talked about. So,
wow.
Yeah. So Boehner wants it to pass.
And do you think it will?
I think that if any, the best chance for any legislation around marijuana is for the Safe Banking Act bill. I think we'll beat it again. It's basically my organization, some parents who have been impacted by marijuana, and law enforcement groups and family groups and folks like that, versus literally billions of dollars in like the American Bankers Association, all these different huge institutions. So it is definitely a David and Goliath fight, I would say. But I think we'll beat it again. We beat it last year. We took on, I think they did some reporting on this. I think they spent around $25 million last year in federal lobbying on SAFE, and we spent like $50,000 and we beat it. So I like our odds.
Yeah. What's the constituencies in Congress that are opposed to and for it?
Yeah, great question. So, basically right now, the godfather of stopping marijuana is definitely Senator Mitch McConnell. He's for whatever reason, I actually don't know his personal reasons, but he's made it a personal mission to not allow marijuana legalization. So he was critical last year in stopping the advance of safe banking. So that's a big piece of it. Is the Senate Republicans have been pretty good on this issue. There are about a dozen Senate Democrats actually who are very much opposed to legalizing marijuana. They've kind of gone more dark in terms of their public persona on this issue because Senate Majority Leader Schumer has made this a top 3 issue, marijuana legalization, which is kind of crazy. But the understanding is so it's interesting with Schumer, interesting story about him, very much a leader in the anti-tobacco movement, very much was opposed to marijuana as early as late as just a couple of years ago. But that changed when the rumors of AOC maybe primarying him started to bubble up. And so then all of a sudden he wanted to take on this marijuana project as maybe his progressive credentials. I don't know. But so that's an interesting dynamic. But having the Senate Majority Leader prioritize more marijuana is a pretty big problem in my opinion. And also I think just a disservice to the country. So anyway, Senate Republicans have been good. In the House, it's an interesting mixed bag. You have folks like Representative Crenshaw who are really, really good on this issue. You have Democrats who, like a few Democrats actually from Colorado, Representative Neguse, who's rising leadership in the Democratic Party, and Crow, who I think have really well-founded concerns around this issue. They're seeing how marijuana is playing out in Colorado. They're seeing the impact to families and kids, and they're starting to kind of raise some awareness around those issues. Now, whether that translates to good votes on it, I don't know. But I think that's something to watch as Democrats are in states where they're seeing the public health harms really come up. And so, yeah, it's kind of an interesting, there's really no hard and set constituency on either side of this issue. It's kind of really person to person, state to state, and kind of what their personal experience is with it.
Yeah, very interesting. The next vista of legalization seems to be a constellation of other much more serious drugs. There's a conversation about psychedelics that seems to be playing out in a very similar way. And then there's the whole decriminalization, injection site movement around drugs like heroin, meth. Walk me through sort of what the outer edge advocates are teeing up for the next 10 years of fights on this and what Sam's approach to it's going to be.
Yeah, so we're seeing a couple of interesting things play out. Psychedelics is one of them. Psychedelics is going exactly how we saw marijuana go because the playbook has been proven to work.
Look at these veterans or look at these cancer patients.
Look at these veterans, look at these cancer patients, call it medical psychedelics, and then eventually be recreational. So I led the fight in my state against the medical psychedelics measure in Colorado. That passed. I was up against the medical community of the Tom Shoes billionaire founder and Dr.
What was the margin?
It was about 54% yes. So it's pretty not that sweeping of a vote. And I think if I'd been able to raise even half the money that they raised, I think probably would have had a chance to beat it. But it's very early on in the psychedelics fight right now. So Oregon is the only other state to do that. So there's a push to get psychedelics out there. They're saying these are natural substances, and we've heard all the same arguments before. Interesting nuance with psychedelics is that the FDA has marked psilocybin or shrooms as a breakthrough therapy. So there is some demonstrated medical benefit in a clinical setting,
right?
And in a regulated setting like that, not in a mail order ketamine, microdosing in Jamaica, for a healing trip. That's not really a clinical setting. But there's clinical value probably to some of these psychedelic drugs, but we need to kind of follow the research process with that. What we're being asked to vote on has nothing to do with the research. It's just clearly so entrepreneurs can make money. And so that we're seeing play out because people think they can make money off of it. We need to be wary of profit incentives with drugs, as I said. But the interesting nuance with psychedelics is that they're not really addictive. At least they're not addictive right now. That could change. So that's an interesting dynamic because folks will say, well, they're less harmful because they're not addictive. But there's other issues at play with these where they're so powerful and mind-altering that we've got issues with hallucinations that continue after somebody's used the substance weeks after. Also issues with psychosis and other just mental illness-related concerns. You don't just take these very powerful mind-altering substances and just kind of think that everything's going to be fine. Lots of issues there. And I won't go much further into it other than I will say a lot of the research that's happening with these psychedelic drugs is with a psychiatrist, a clinical professional who's sitting in a room with somebody who's tripping for 6 to 8 hours. Okay, so it's a very intensive, long therapy that's going on here. Very different from what people are assuming where, oh, I'll just, buy this or grow it in my backyard and trip out in my house with a bunch of my friends. Like that, dangerous. You're putting yourself at the mercy of people around you. And we are seeing, unfortunately, rising cases of people being taken advantage of sexually in these situations with using psychedelics. So lots of risk factors, things unknowns, all that stuff there. But really where we're headed, though, is the legalization of all drugs. And it's going to start with safe injection and safe supply. So Oregon has become the first state to decriminalize all drugs, everything. It's a $100 fine if you're caught with heroin and you're 14 years old. If you pay that fine, your parents don't even know about it. Literally. No one's going to treatment. No one's getting access to services to help with their addiction. And Oregon basically just said, forget it. Just do whatever you want. Okay. So starts with, they call it treatment over incarceration. Great concept, except for the fact that no one's getting access to treatment. No one's funding treatment. Nobody's helping folks in addiction. So it's a whole other question, but starts there. Then they say injection sites, because we need injection sites where people can safely, quote unquote, safely inject drugs that won't be, so if they overdose, they can have their overdose reversed with naloxone. And it's basically like just the worst of all worlds from a policy perspective, because it's a Band-Aid solution that sustains people's addiction. It doesn't help them. The folks that go into these injection sites, there's 2 now in New York that are federally illegal. There's one that's been going for 10 plus years in Vancouver, British Columbia, where we can kind of see what's happened there. And what's happened is their opioid rates are worse than our rates are in America without them. So it clearly has not helped. But we got 2 now in New York. And so they'll say, well, no one's died in these injection sites. Well, 90+% of people that go into those injection sites to use these drugs, they're using their drugs still out on the streets too. So they're still going to OD and possibly die later, just not in that injection site. So starts there. And then there's a thing called safe supply. And, Senator Rubio was really stunned with the whole idea of crack pipes being taxpayer funded. I told one of his top staff members, I said, just wait till he hears about safe supply, because safe supply is this concept that, well, we've got a fentanyl crisis going on, and drugs are tainted with fentanyl and killing people. So the government should supply pure heroin, pure whatever the drug of choice is, to make sure there's no fentanyl in it, and give it out to users for free to keep them alive. And so that's where this is heading, is basically pharmaceutical grade access to all the various substances out there. And that's something that's already happening in Canada right now. So those are the kinds of fights that we're kind of keeping an eye on and having to kind of educate folks on.
What is the reason that drug supply is tainted with fentanyl?
Yeah, great question. So 2 answers to that. So the first thing we should understand is that a large number of people now are addicted directly to fentanyl. So there's this notion out there that if people just knew fentanyl was in there, so there's like fentanyl test strips, like you can test your drugs to see if fentanyl's in them. They think that folks are out there saying, if people just know that fentanyl's in there, then they won't use it. It's not the case. Fentanyl is a high that is 100% more potent than heroin. So people are seeking that now because it's so much more potent, and the high is much better, and people like that. So it's being sought after. So that is an important thing to kind of set the record straight on. But in addition, yes, there's a lot of drugs, though, that are tainted with fentanyl. And the reason why is because of that potency and of that better high. So, people are getting different drugs. Dealers are cutting it with fentanyl to give it a little more oomph, to make it maybe a little more addictive, keep their people coming back to them. So there's kind of a supply and demand thing happening with that. And where people are dying is fentanyl is so potent. We've all heard the stories, one little grain can kill you. So it's being done in a very rudimentary way. It's being cut into these substances.
You're telling me the trailer park where they're cutting these drugs is not a biochemical.
It's not a biochemical lab. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yep. Yeah. And so then you have the folks who say, well, it should be a biochemical lab. So let's let the pharmaceutical companies help make sure that it's pure and that it's, all these things. But what you end up doing there is just sustaining addiction and keeping people on a government supplied dope, which I think is kind of a problematic place to go.
Luke, where can people keep up with everything that you guys are working on at SAM? And more importantly, I think, because I'm sure we have a ton of skeptics listening to this, where can they find all the documentation for everything you just
Yeah. So check out our website, learnaboutsam.org. It's got everything on marijuana that you could need. Our science advisory board, you can check them out. People from Harvard, Princeton, Yale doing research on marijuana today. So we really cut our teeth on the science. You'll see that on our website, learnaboutsam.org. And then for our work on other drugs, you can go to our sister organization. It's called Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions, gooddrugpolicy.org. gooddrugpolicy.org, because we think we need good drug policy, not bad.
And where can people follow you online?
Yeah, so check me out on Twitter, Luke Niforatos. You'll have a hard time spelling that, but if you just do Luke Nif, you'll find me. I'm the only Niforatos on Twitter.
Yeah, and you seem to have a lot of trolls that seem to be quite annoyed with you most of the time.
Yep. I found that if my enemies tend to be folks who have no profile picture, and they follow about 200 accounts and have 0 followers, and they like to harass. So if you want to get in on that action, just shoot me a reply, and I'm sure they'll jump on.
Fantastic. Well, Luke, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Sir Rob, and thanks for the great work American Moment's doing. I think it's really changing the game here in DC.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. As I said, be sure to send some feedback to us. Email podcast@americanmoment.org. If you'd like to put a comment there or ask us a question, always be sure to reach out to us at americanmoment.org/join to get involved. Be sure to rate and review this podcast, and be sure to come to AM Fridays this summer, our cutting edge summer lunch series on Capitol Hill. We're always grateful this summer season because we have our new fellows class starting. Foundation is about to get started. AM Fridays is going. We're releasing this podcast every week. It's exceptionally busy, but it's one of those seasons of the year where I'm reminded that we are extraordinarily blessed to have a very, very cool job here in DC. Thank you guys, as always, for being parts of it. Be sure to check out Luke's work. Go to learnaboutsam.org. Be sure to go to americanmoment.org, and we will see you guys next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production, filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to americanmoment.org to learn more.